Hello and welcome. In this video we'll be taking a look at a fun Necron list that's unlike any we've looked at before. And while I say that about most of the lists we look at, that's because I try to hunt down lists that are interesting and not just cover the same lists over and over. Anyway, with that being said, let's see how this list performed. This list came in first place out of 30 players in the Hertfordshire Winter GT, held in Great Britain on December 3rd, 2022. This list was played by a player named Matthew Putney, and it is composed of a dynasty we haven't seen yet, which is the Neolac Dynasty. For those unaware, the Neolac Dynasty is a dynasty very similar to the very popular Custom Dynasty, as the first bonus of the Neolac Dynasty is that all units that belong to this dynasty gain the Objective Secured ability and count as an additional model in situations where they already have Objective Secure on their profile. This is a very powerful ability and pretty much why you go into a Custom Dynasty, so essentially you're trading off the 6-inch pregame move or other options for the following benefits that the Neolac Dynasty provides. There are two additional benefits from the Neolac Dynasty, the first one being the second half of the Dynastic Codes, which says that attacks with 1 armor penetration targeting models that are wholly within your deployment zone are treated as 0 instead of 1. This is a bit of a weaker ability and really kind of situational depending on how much you expect to play within your deployment zone. That being said, there are going to be situations where it's a rather nice ability to have and can really annoy your opponent with some of their light firepower. However, do keep in mind it doesn't really have much effect against heavier firepower and is essentially what is a watch ability and pretty much what kept the Neolac Dynasty down. Now don't forget, each dynasty has a special protocol benefits, and with the improvement of how protocols work, the protocols are all of a sudden now much more important than they once were in the past. For the Neolac Dynasty, the protocol that they gain the double benefits from is the protocol of the Eternal Guardian. And the Eternal Guardian protocol says that if a unit didn't move, advance, or fall back, it gains the benefits of having light cover, which improves their armor save, making them even more durable. In addition to that, when a unit is charged with this protocol, the unit can hold steady in order to gain +1 to their Overwatch fire, or set to defend to gain +1 to hit on their melee attacks for that combat. Both are pretty good abilities, and both offer you some ability to counterplay your opponent in many different ways. That being said, don't forget that each dynasty also has a unique relic, trait, and stratagem, so you do have to keep those in mind. If you'd like to learn more about the dynasties, check the description below for the video I made specifically about the different Necron dynasties. With that being said, it really does come down to your preference if you want to go with the Neolac Dynasty or the different benefits it offers in addition to Objective Secured, or you want to go into the Custom Dynasty where you still get that very powerful Objective Secure ability, but you can choose to gain a 6-inch pregame move or other benefits in addition to that Objective Secured if you happen to not like the Neolac Dynasty ones. Also, don't forget, there are plenty of other dynasty choices that can be viable within the 9th edition rules. Anyway, with that being said, let's dive into the list itself. The list begins with a patrol detachment, and as all patrol detachments do, this patrol detachment starts off with its HQ choices. The first of the HQ choices is a rather powerful one, being a Catacomb Command Barge. And the Catacomb Command Barge is a very durable HQ choice that can be incredibly resilient and incredibly good in terms of putting out damage. In fact, the player in this situation decided to improve both offensive and defensive capabilities of this Catacomb Command Barge by giving it both a trait and a relic. So let's take a look at the trait that the Catacomb Command Barge has. This Catacomb Command Barge has been given the Enduring Will. The Enduring Will reduces the damage this model takes by 1 to a minimum of 1. On a unit that is as durable as a Catacomb Command Barge, this trait can actually go quite a long way and is one that you'll see rather commonly on units such as this and Illuminar Xeris, simply due to their already very durable profile. And as for the relic, this Catacomb Command Barge has had its Staff of Light upgraded to the Voltaic Staff, giving it a bit more punch when making range attacks, and don't forget, because this is a vehicle model, this model can make its shooting attacks in close combat as well. In addition to those upgrades, the weapon that the Catacomb Command Barge has in this situation has been upgraded to a Gauss Cannon, giving it even more firepower. All in all, a very powerful HQ choice, and one that your opponents can definitely struggle with. And with that being said, we move on to our second HQ choice for this patrol detachment. The second HQ choice is one that we've seen quite often nowadays, that being a Cryptek known as the Technomancer. The Technomancer is definitely a great model that can help support your different units and revive them as the game goes on, while providing other utility benefits. And as most Technomancers are, this one has been upgraded with a Canoptic Cloak, as it's a rather mild points cost to enable your Technomancer to move significantly more quickly, have the flying keyword to allow him to avoid different terrain, and gives him the ability to repair some wounds on units that are still alive in addition to all that, so it's really hard to pass up that upgrade simply because of how cheap and powerful it is. Anyway, those are the HQ choices, and we can move on to troop choices. The troop choices in this case are very minimal for this patrol detachment, in this case being a unit of 5 Immortals armed with Gauss blasters. The Immortals are definitely the popular low-cost HQ choice and have definitely taken over the Necron Warriors, despite the Necron Warriors starting off being the most popular choice when the 9th edition Codex first came out. And with that being said, we won't linger too long on the troops and we can move on to the fast attack choice. The fast attack choice begins off with a rather standard pick, being a unit of 9 Canoptic Scarab Swarms. However, that being said, a unit of 9 is larger than we normally see, as many times Scarab Swarms are kept between 3 and 6 nowadays. However, in this situation, the player decided to go with a maximum squad, bringing 9 Scarab bases total. This is a little bit peculiar, but it will make a little more sense as we continue looking at the list, and there's nothing really wrong with bringing 9 Scarab Swarms. The second fast attack choice, though, for this patrol detachment is a much more interesting one. The second choice is a unit of 9 Tomb Blades. All of these Tomb Blades have been armed with particle beamers, and the particle beamers are the only free weapon choice that the Tomb Blades have access to, giving them 6 assault shots at an 18-inch range with a strength of 5, 0 armor penetration, and 1 damage. I definitely think this gives you quite a lot of firepower, but I do think I prefer the Twin Gauss Blasters a little more than the particle beamer. The Twin Gauss Blaster does give you a different profile with a longer range of 30 inches, a rapid fire of 2, and the same profile overall, except that it has 2 additional points of armor penetration. However, that being said, the Gauss Blaster, in comparison to the particle beamer, does cost an additional 5 points, making it a little bit of an expensive choice on a unit such as this because of the large quantity of Tomb Blade. That being said, however, do also keep in mind that there's a lot more ways of ignoring armor penetration nowadays, especially with things like Armor of Contempt and different armies having different ways of negating some level of armor penetration, so maybe there's more reason to go with something like the particle beamer, which gives you a high volume of shots instead of a high quality of shot. That being said though, do also keep in mind that the 18-inch range is a little bit awkward. However, at the same time, the Tomb Blades are an incredibly fast unit and can move around the table very easily. One other thing to keep in mind about this unit of Tomb Blades is that all 9 Tomb Blades have been given the Shadow Loom. The Shadow Loom is a rather inexpensive upgrade, being only 3 points and giving them a 5+ invulnerable save. This definitely makes them a lot more durable, and I definitely like the Shadow Loom over the Shield Veins in most situations. However, in a large unit such as this, I would have liked to have seen at least a few Shield Veins as well, just to give yourself the ability to distribute the wounds a little more effectively in situations where that additional point of armor save does come in handy. And to kind of wrap up this unit of 9 Tomb Blades, considering how fast and how powerful a unit it can be, the total cost of this entire unit is only 207 points, which is actually rather points efficient for what you're getting out of that unit, considering it can clean out swarm units rather well, can be a rather fast and durable objective holder, and can also be rather annoying even to rather elite units, simply because you're getting a total of 54 shots on those particle beamers if you can get them all in range to fire on a specific target, and with that volume of shots, they're bound to fail at least a few of them on average, even if they're coming in with no armor penetration. Moving on from the fast attack choice, this patrol detachment has 2 additional unit types, one being a heavy support choice, which is a single Locust Heavy Destroyer armed with a Gauss Destructor, giving you a little bit of a heavy hitting unit, although not particularly a consistent one. I do think this is an okay choice, simply because the Locust Heavy Destroyer is super inexpensive, and in situations where it is effective, it can be rather impressive. However, in other situations, you might just use it to move on to objectives or table quarters, simply because it's inexpensive enough to fulfill that role, and to still provide some firepower at a good enough distance to be within play without having to be completely tied up on an objective by itself, without being able to contribute to the game otherwise. So in that sense, it kind of functions like the death marks do in many situations, though the benefit that it gives is a bit different than the death marks in themselves, and I think there's kind of an interesting trade-off that you make when you make that decision. Anyway, as for the second unit type that this patrol detachment includes, that is a flyer that is becoming rather prevalent in most Necron lists, that being the Doom Scythe. As we've covered in the past, the Doom Scythe is a lot more consistent than something like the Doomsday Arc or the Doomstalker, and in addition to that, because of the many points costs that are received, it has now become a very efficient unit to include in many Necron lists, and that's why you're seeing it a lot more often than you did before. And because of the inclusion of it in different lists, I always like to remind people that the combat patrol for the Necrons has definitely gone a lot better, because now you're seeing a lot more Immortals, you're seeing a lot more Doom Scythes, and as such you're getting a lot more value out of the models in that kit for the reduced price that the kit comes for. In any case, that concludes the first patrol detachment for this army list. With the first patrol detachment covered, we can move on to the second detachment, which is a Vanguard detachment, meaning you're going to see a bit more of an elite detachment. The Vanguard detachment begins off with an HQ choice, as most detachments do. This HQ choice is yet another cryptic that is rather popular within modern Necron lists. this Cryptek being a Chronomancer. The Chronomancer has been armed with an Aeon Stave, keeping its points cost a little bit lower, however it has also been upgraded with an Arcana. The Arcana is one that we've seen recently and one that we haven't really seen before this list and the list previous that contained one of these Arcana. In this case, the Arcana is the Prismatic Obfuscatron. This Arcana costs a total of 15 points and says that the bear cannot be targeted with range attacks unless it's the closest eligible model to enemy units. That's kind of an interesting inclusion, and once again, I'm kind of wondering what changed that makes the inclusion of this Arcana a little more prevalent throughout lists. However, that being said, it's not the most common inclusion, it's just something that I've seen pop up a little more often than it used to. I'm guessing that players have been seeing a little bit more of an increase of their softer characters, such as the Cryptics, being targeted by enemy units, or they're simply positioning their Chronomancers in such ways that make them a little more vulnerable than they otherwise would be in certain situations. In either case, it's a bit of an interesting inclusion, and it's not the most expensive one. However, I do think sometimes you might have better places to spend those 15 points than say on something like an Arcana that may or may not come into play. However, at the end of the day, it really comes down to what you feel comfortable with, so never forgo any kind of upgrade or inclusion of any kind of unit if you think it legitimately contributes to how your army plays. With that being said, this Chronomancer also has been upgraded with a relic. In this case, the relic being a Veil of Darkness, allowing him to teleport himself and a different unit into a different position. Maybe this is why they've chosen this relic in specific, as maybe there are situations where they teleport a unit and then perform moves in such a way where it may leave the Chronomancer vulnerable if they were not equipped with the Arcana that they have been given. In either case, it's a bit of an interesting inclusion, but also a bit of a standard one, as the Chronomancer definitely benefits from the Veil of Darkness, as he can easily teleport a unit and then proceed to buff the unit so the unit can more easily engage. Usually, you're going to be teleporting a more melee offensive unit, and combine that with the Tomb Blades that we've already seen, as well as the Scarab Swarms, Catacomb Command Barge, and Canoptic Cloak Technomancer, and you have a bit of a fast-moving list already. However, this list continues on with the lead choice for this Vanguard attachment. The lead choice for this Vanguard attachment begins with a unit that we haven't seen very commonly up until recently, where it's kind of come back into the meta, despite it being rather popular when the 9th edition Codex first came out. If you haven't guessed already, this unit is a Canoptic Spider, and the Canoptic Spider is a rather durable unit, although it's not the most powerful offensive unit out there. However, it can definitely hold its own and can provide support to that large unit of Scarab Swarms, giving them some ability to recoup some of their lost numbers, making that 9-model Scarab Swarm a lot more interesting and a lot more resilient when paired up with that Canoptic Spider. In addition to that, this Canoptic Spider has been given an upgrade known as the Gloom Prism, which allows it to attempt to deny psychic powers, and something that I like seeing, especially since there are a lot of popular psychic armies. This combined with other units within this army list definitely allow this army list to put up a little bit more of a fight against psychic armies than it might otherwise be able to in certain situations if it didn't include these different units that can contest some different psychic powers. Anyway, moving on to the second elite choice of this Vanguard attachment, and the second elite choice is a unit of 5 Flayed Ones. The Flayed Ones pretty much saw no play when the 9th edition Codex first came out, and then they saw a decent amount of play within the previous chapter approved. However, with the advent of the Nephilim chapter approved, they definitely saw a bit of a disappearance from the meta altogether, simply because the meta saw a surge in durable models that the Flayed Ones had a very difficult time contesting. However, that being said, the Flayed Ones are still a decently cheap enough choice and can still be a decent enough annoyance, especially with their melee profile and their ability to take position on different parts of the board. As such, I think it's fine enough to include a unit of 5 of them, maybe even a larger unit if you expect to go up against a lot of armies that have a bit of a lower armor profile and have a bit more of a swarmy characteristic, where the Flayed Ones can take advantage of some of those lighter units. And with that being said, we move on to the third and final lead choice for this Vanguard attachment. The final lead choice is a unit of 6 Scorpic Destroyers, with a single upgrade being a Canoptic Plasmacyte that occupies no Force Organization slot. The Scorpic Destroyers are definitely a very powerful offensive melee unit that can make quick work out of most enemies that it targets. In addition to that, combine them with the Chronomancer and the different buffs that the Chronomancer can give, as well as the ability for the Plasmacyte to overcharge them, and all of a sudden you have a very deadly unit that can absolutely obliterate anything that comes into contact on the opponent's side. As such, your opponent is definitely going to have to respect the Scorpic Destroyers and definitely have to pay attention to them as the game progresses, because if they disrespect the Scorpic Destroyers, they're definitely in for a world of hurt. In any case, we've definitely seen the Scorpic Destroyers very commonly. However, the biggest difference between the current meta and the meta 6 months ago is mostly that instead of seeing 3 units of Scorpic Destroyers, we're more commonly seeing 1 to 2 units with a mix of many different other types of units within army lists, and as such, you see a bit more of a diversity in different Necron lists, as opposed to the majority of them being hyper-aggressive lists packed with a bunch of Scorpic Destroyers and other types of destroyers just to get into melee combat and obliterate your opponent, and this is probably mostly because a lot more lists have a lot more durability and the ability to fight back against units such as this. Not to mention things like Imperial and Chaos Knights definitely being a bit of a rough time for Scorpic destroyers and other melee focused armies. In any case, I definitely think there's still plenty of room for melee options with the Necron armies, and as we can see here, this list definitely included a decent amount of them. With the lead choice covered for the Vanguard detachment, we can move on to the fast attack choice within the Vanguard detachment. This Vanguard detachment includes 2 different fast attack choices, both those choices composed of a unit of 3 Tomb Blades, armed with particle beamers, and given an upgrade of Shadow Loom on each of the Tomb Blades. Once again, similar to the first unit of Tomb Blades we saw, except these are both minimal units, most likely used for taking board positions and different objectives as the game progresses, as opposed to being more of a resilient and offensive unit. Do remember that the Tomb Blades are very fast moving, and that even in small numbers such as this, those particle beamers can definitely put out a decent amount of shots. And one other thing I want to point out is that a unit of 3 of them with this kind of loadout is only 69 points, which is actually kind of surprising, as I definitely expect them to be a little more expensive for whatever reason, as I felt like they're a bit of a more powerful unit than the points cost would suggest in this situation. In any case, I do think that's kind of an interesting utilization of different fast-moving units within this army list, and I do think it shows kind of the power of the Tomb Blades that maybe people were overlooking, because it didn't seem like they were seeing that much play. Although they've been becoming a lot more popular within recent times, we haven't really seen a list that went quite as heavily on Tomb Blades as this list has. And don't forget, once again, the Tomb Blades are included within that combat patrol, and they're actually a rather powerful unit when you consider what they can do. I definitely would have maybe liked to see one of these units have their weapons upgraded to those Twin Gauss blasters, just so you had more opportunity in order to position them and fire off some shots with that better armor penetration characteristic at a bit of a farther range than with the particle beamers alone. However, the next choice that we're going to look at within this army list might explain a little bit why the Tomb Blades weren't given those upgrades, as the next choice we're going to look at is a heavy support choice composed of 4 regular Locust Destroyers, and that unit includes 1 Locust Heavy Destroyer in addition to those 4 regular Destroyers, with the Locust Heavy Destroyer being armed with yet another Gauss Destructor. So why do I say these might explain the particle beamers on the Tomb Blades? Well, the big thing about the regular Locust Destroyers within the Necron forces is that they essentially offer a lot of mid-range firepower, and something that kind of kept them out of lists previously was that Necrons had plenty of different ways of generating that mid-range firepower. However, in a situation like this, where you've chosen to go with more of a lightweight volume of firepower on those Tomb Blades, you can take something like the Locust regular Destroyers to give yourself access to some of that mid-range firepower that you don't have on other units within your army list in this situation. And that really shows the versatility of the Necrons, as you have that ability to compensate for the lack of anything within a list, depending on what units you include. So even if you forgo something on one type of unit, you always have the ability of finding that kind of profile on a different unit. Because even let's say if you didn't take something like those Scorpic Destroyers, there are other units that can fulfill the role, such as Lich Guard or even Canoptic Wraiths. Though they fill a bit of a different role than the Scorpic Destroyers do, same with the Locust regular Destroyers, than other mid-range firepower units. However, they're similar enough to give yourself the ability to substitute them in for other types of units. In any case, I do think that's a very interesting inclusion, and once again I think this shows the ability of this list to utilize its mobility, as well as to utilize units in a very different way than we've seen in the past, because while none of the inclusions are that particularly groundbreaking, I do think the way they're included is what really changes how this list plays. However, that being said, this list does not conclude with this Vanguard detachment, but rather includes one additional detachment type, being that of a Supreme Command. And as we all know what the Supreme Command is within most Necron lists, that being the Silent King, we can pretty much gloss over him a little bit, because at the end of the day, the Silent King is a very durable model with incredibly powerful heavy firepower and a lot of utility and support for the Necron forces. I will say that the Silent King is an incredibly powerful model for the points that he comes in at, and pretty much is a very easy inclusion within most Necron lists. Sure, he did get a little weaker in the errata that was put out a little while ago, however, the change that was made to him isn't particularly that vital, and he's still an incredibly powerful unit that still does more than enough for his points cost. In any case, if you're interested in learning more about the Silent King, you can check out the other list videos I did for the Necrons, as the majority of 2,000 point lists will include him, as well as a super heavy video I did for the Necrons in the Necron playlist, where I go into more depth and detail about the Silent King himself. With that being said, that kind of concludes the look at this list, and I do think it's a very interesting list indeed, because it includes a lot of different things that we don't necessarily normally see within Necron forces. Although we've definitely seen all these different models in the past, these models definitely have a very different way of being applied within a list like this. because look at all the different selections within the list and ask yourself how many of the different units have a 6-inch movement speed and how many have a movement speed greater or equal to 8 inches. You will quickly notice that the majority of this list moves at a faster pace than most enemy armies, and that's a very interesting way of playing because it really gives you the ability to outposition and outmaneuver your opponents. However, you do have a little bit of a lack of heavy firepower. Even though you have that Doom Scythe and a couple of those Locust Heavy Destroyers, you really don't have a ton of different ways of dealing with potentially more armored units. However, that being said, the Silent King and the Catacomb Command Barge can definitely do a decent amount of work, and the Silent King in his own right is a bit of an incredibly powerful unit, both in range and melee, and can definitely do enough to compensate for some of the lack of heavy firepower that this list might experience. In any case, I do think it's a very interesting list, and let me know down in the comments below, do you think this is a different enough list than other lists we've looked at the past, or do you think this is simply the natural evolution of Necron forces as we've seen within the 9th edition? Once again, I would like to say thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed the content, please do like and subscribe as it definitely helps the channel out in the algorithm, and as always, have a great day, see you next time.